the rifle that would not fire. At 5:40 in the morning on December 5, 1941, west of Moscow, a German infantryman from Army Group Center lay half buried in snow and tried to move the bolt of his rifle. It did not move cleanly. His fingers were inside gloves that had never been meant for this kind of cold. The wool had hardened. The leather was stiff. His breath came out in short white bursts and froze along the edge of his scarf. Somewhere to his left, a horse coughed, stumbled, and went quiet. Farther back, an engine turned once, twice, then failed with a dry metallic choke. The front was supposed to be still. For hours, there had been only the wind, the creaking of frozen wood, and the occasional crack of ice in the trees. Then, before dawn, the first Soviet guns began to speak. Not in one great roar. Not yet. A shell landed beyond the German line, muffled by snow. Then another. Then a third, closer. Men lifted their heads from foxholes and dugouts, blinking into the darkness, trying to understand whether this was harassment fire or something larger. The field ahead was pale, almost empty. A few black tree trunks. A broken fence. A road buried under snow. Then the snow moved. White shapes appeared where there had been nothing. Soviet soldiers in winter camouflage, padded jackets, thick mittens, and fur-lined caps advanced through the gray light in short, careful rushes. They did not look like the army German propaganda had described. They looked tired. They looked human. But they were moving. That was the important thing. They were moving while German men were struggling to stand. They were advancing while German weapons resisted the hands that held them. They were coming forward through the weather that German commanders had treated as an inconvenience, a delay, a seasonal difficulty to be endured after victory. The infantryman pulled harder on the rifle bolt. The metal answered with a scrape. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but in that moment it carried the weight of a campaign. The German army had crossed borders, shattered armies, surrounded cities, and driven hundreds of miles into the Soviet Union. Its commanders had believed in speed. Its soldiers had believed in training. Its machines had believed, if machines can believe, in fuel, oil, spare parts, and roads. But now the oil was thick. The roads were buried. The spare parts were far behind. And the soldier in the snow was discovering that winter did not care what had worked in France. Across the field, a Soviet machine gun opened fire. The first burst went high. Snow kicked from the branches above him. The second burst was lower. A man somewhere behind the infantryman shouted. Not a command, just a sound forced out of the body before fear could become language. He finally moved the bolt. Then he realized his trigger finger had almost no feeling left. This was not how the German High Command had imagined the road to Moscow. The maps had shown arrows, timetables, roads, rail lines, encirclements. The war had been drawn in clean strokes on paper. But paper did not show how leather froze. It did not show how a man's toes slowly stopped belonging to him. It did not show the smell of cold metal, damp wool, old sweat, and snow pressed into the mouth when artillery forced a man flat against the earth. The German soldier had been told, in different ways and from different places, that the Soviet Union would fall before winter could become decisive. He had not been told that the enemy's heavy jackets, felt boots, mittens, and white smocks, the things that looked crude, backward, almost laughable beside the sharp uniforms of a modern European army, might keep men alive long enough to fight. And that was the first truth Moscow forced into the open. Not that winter won the war alone. It did not. Not that Soviet soldiers did not suffer. They suffered terribly. But before Moscow, winter became more than weather. It became a test of preparation, logistics, humility, and survival knowledge. It attacked engines, rifles, boots, horses, skin, lungs, and morale. It found every assumption the German army had carried east and pressed on it until something cracked. The Soviet soldier in his padded jacket was not protected from war. He was protected enough to keep moving through it. The German soldier, still fighting with his frozen rifle, was beginning to understand a reality his commanders had missed. The danger was not only the Soviet troops emerging from the snow. The danger was that Germany had prepared to defeat an enemy before winter arrived, and now winter had arrived as part of the enemy. And to understand why that rifle would not fire, why men froze before Moscow, and why the clothing once mocked became a weapon of survival, we have to return to the summer of 1941, when the German army still believed the season would never get a vote. Victory before the first snow. On June 22, 1941, the German army crossed into the Soviet Union under a sky that belonged to summer. The roads were dusty. Engines ran hot, not cold. Tank crews opened hatches for air. Infantrymen marched with sweat under their helmets, with boots darkened by dust and oil rather than snow. Behind them came field kitchens, ammunition carts, fuel trucks, medical wagons, horse teams, radio vans, staff cars, and the long nervous tail of an army built to move fast. Operation Barbarossa was not imagined as a winter war. That fact matters. It was not simply that German soldiers lacked enough winter clothing later. It was that the campaign had been built around the belief that such clothing would not decide anything. The enemy would be broken before then. Soviet armies would be encircled. Moscow would be threatened or taken. The political system would fracture. The Red Army, already battered by purges, surprise, and early disaster, would not survive the hammer blows that had destroyed so many others. For a time, that belief seemed to have evidence behind it. Poland had fallen. France had fallen. The German army had crossed Europe with terrifying speed. Its commanders had seen what concentration, maneuver, air support, and radio coordination could do to slower opponents. They had learned to trust the map arrow, the armored spearhead, the collapse of command systems under pressure. Then came the first weeks in the Soviet Union. Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, Kiev. The numbers were enormous. Soviet prisoners taken in the hundreds of thousands. Equipment destroyed or abandoned. Roads choked with refugees, wreckage, cattle, carts, and soldiers moving in opposite directions. To many German officers, the early victories seemed to confirm the original belief. The Soviet Union was vast, yes. Brutal, yes. But it was bleeding at a scale no state could endure indefinitely. And yet there was something wrong beneath the success. The Soviet Union did not collapse. The distances kept widening. The Red Army kept forming new lines. Units that should have been destroyed reappeared in another sector. Roads turned into tracks. Tracks dissolved into mud. The map arrows moved forward, but behind them the supply lines stretched thinner and thinner until every kilometer became a debt. Still, in the summer and early autumn, the central belief remained alive: one more push. One more encirclement. One more blow. Moscow before the worst cold. Victory before winter. This belief was not held only by generals. It filtered downward. A staff officer looking at a schedule could believe it. A tanker who had seen Soviet units break under pressure could believe it. A young infantryman, exhausted but still advancing, could believe it because the alternative was too large to hold in the mind. No one wants to imagine a war without an ending when he is already hundreds of miles from home. Winter, in this imagination, was a future problem. And future problems have a way of feeling less urgent than today's ammunition, today's fuel, today's bridge, today's wounded. A winter coat took up transport space. So did spare boots. So did mittens, antifreeze, lubricants, blankets, medical supplies, and replacement parts. An army always moves by choices, and every choice leaves something behind. In 1941, the German army made those choices under the shadow of a promise. The decisive campaign would end before winter could become decisive. That promise made thin gloves seem acceptable. It made summer-weight uniforms seem temporary. It made delay seem tolerable, because delay still belonged to a schedule that could be recovered. But the Soviet Union was not France. The roads were different. The distances were different. The enemy's ability to absorb disaster was different. And the weather was not waiting politely at the edge of the campaign. By October, the roads began to change. Autumn rains turned movement into struggle. Vehicles sank to their axles. Horses strained in mud. Soldiers cursed at wheels, ropes, broken boards, and the endless sucking earth. Then the mud hardened. At first, that seemed like relief. Frozen ground meant movement again. But the same cold that hardened the roads was moving into everything else. Engines needed different care. Weapons needed different oils. Men needed clothing that had not arrived. Horses needed feed that was already difficult to bring forward. Medical stations needed supplies for injuries that did not come from bullets. The calendar had become a battlefield instrument. German commanders could still look at Moscow on the map and see a target. But the men on the roads were beginning to experience a different map entirely. A map of cold fingers, empty stomachs, stiff boots, fuel barrels that did not arrive. Letters from home that spoke of winter clothing drives, as if the people far away were beginning to understand what the army itself had not prepared for in time. The first belief had been simple: win before winter. The battlefield reality was quieter, heavier, and more dangerous. The war was still going when the first snow came. And when it came, the German army discovered that winter did not begin with a dramatic storm. It began with small failures. A truck that would not start. A boot that would not dry. A rifle that needed cleaning more often than a man had strength to clean it. A sentry stamping his feet through the night, then realizing at dawn that stamping had not been enough. The German army had not yet frozen before Moscow, but the system behind it was already cooling piece by piece. And the first place winter attacked was not the front line. It was the long, strained road leading to it. The supply line that could not keep men warm. A German division did not live only where its soldiers stood. It lived behind them in columns of trucks and horse carts, in railheads and depots, in repair workshops, field kitchens, fuel dumps, medical stations, and clerks with frozen ink trying to account for things that had already been lost. The rifleman in the snow was only the visible edge of a much larger body. If that body failed, the man at the front would feel it first in his stomach, then in his feet, then in his hands. By late 1941, that body was under strain. The German army had advanced deep into a country whose distances punished every assumption made in Berlin and at field headquarters. Railways had to be repaired and converted. Bridges had to be rebuilt. Roads that looked passable on maps became broken tracks under traffic. Trucks wore out faster than planned. Horses, still essential to German movement, died in large numbers from exhaustion, hunger, and cold. This is one of the less dramatic truths of the war, but it matters more than drama. A soldier does not freeze only because the air is cold. He freezes because the coat is not there, because the boots are worn through, because the blanket is on a train still far behind the front, because the truck carrying winter clothing broke down beside a road, and the repair part for that truck was somewhere even farther back, because fuel was given priority over gloves, and ammunition over spare socks, and every choice made sense until the temperature dropped. There were German winter supplies. There were efforts to collect and send clothing. There were officers who understood the danger. There were men in the rear working honestly, desperately, sometimes intelligently, to solve the problem. But the front did not need concern. It needed delivery. And delivery in Russia had become a war of its own. Imagine a supply officer in November 1941, standing beside a road west of Moscow. He has a list: ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, replacement weapons, horse fodder, radio batteries, winter clothing. Every item is urgent. Every item has a voice behind it. The artillery wants shells. The tank unit wants fuel. The infantry wants bread. The hospital wants bandages. The commander wants all of it moved forward by morning. But the road is narrow. The weather is closing. The trucks are tired. Horses are slipping. Partisans and Soviet aircraft threaten the rear. The railhead is not close enough. The map says the distance is manageable. The road says otherwise. Now add winter clothing to that list. A coat is not heavy like an artillery shell, but thousands of coats become weight. Boots take space. Blankets take space. Mittens take space. Special lubricants take space. Stoves, fuel, tents, medical supplies for frostbite, all of it has to move along the same fragile arteries as the materials of combat. And that was the hidden problem. The German army had entered the Soviet Union as a force of offensive motion. It had been designed to create crises for the enemy faster than the enemy could respond. But by winter, the crisis was inside the German system itself. Speed had created distance. Distance had created dependence. Dependence had created vulnerability. The Soviet side had its own suffering, its own shortages, its own chaos. No honest account should pretend otherwise. Red Army soldiers froze too. Soviet civilians endured hunger and cold on a scale difficult to describe. The war in the East did not spare anyone. But the Soviet state and army understood the climate as part of existence. Winter was not a surprise in the same cultural and operational sense. Equipment could be crude. Distribution could be harsh. Planning could be brutal. Yet the knowledge of cold, how it entered boots, machines, weapons, sleep, and morale, existed in the bones of the system. German soldiers learned quickly, but they learned under fire. They learned that a wet boot could become a medical emergency. They learned that shaving could be dangerous because exposed skin froze quickly. They learned that metal touched with bare fingers could take skin with it. They learned that oil suitable for one climate could become a liability in another. They learned that a horse was not just transport but warmth, food, movement, and survival, and that dead horses on frozen roads meant a division was losing more than animals. And they learned that improvisation has limits. Men wrapped themselves in captured Soviet clothing, blankets, bits of carpet, curtains taken from village houses, newspaper, straw, anything that could create a layer between flesh and air. Some looked less like soldiers than refugees from their own campaign. Photographs from that winter do not show the clean lines of military confidence. They show men swallowed by whatever they could find. The belief had been that winter preparation was secondary to victory. The reality was that survival had become a prerequisite for fighting at all. At the front, officers could demand discipline. They could order positions held. They could speak of duty, endurance, and necessity. But a man with frostbitten feet cannot march because a sentence on paper tells him to. A machine gun with frozen parts does not fire because command insists that it must. An engine that will not start cannot be persuaded by ideology. Winter reduced war to fundamentals. Can the man move? Can the weapon fire? Can the truck start? Can food reach the line? Can the wounded be moved before they freeze? By the end of November, these questions were no longer background concerns. They were becoming the battlefield itself. And while German units tried to pull warmth from a supply system already stretched beyond its strength, Soviet soldiers were bringing forward something less elegant, less modern-looking, but far more suited to the world around Moscow. They brought winter as equipment, not as theory, not as decoration, as survival stitched into cloth, felt, fur, and habit. The gear they thought was backward. The Soviet winter uniform did not look like a weapon. It had no barrel, no engine, no armor plate. It did not appear in battlefield statistics the way tanks and guns appeared. It did not make the sharp silhouette of modern war. Padded jacket could look shapeless. Felt boots could look old. Mittens could seem clumsy to men trained to value precision. White camouflage could look almost primitive until it made a soldier disappear against snow. That was the mistake. War often hides its most important tools in plain sight. The Soviet Telegrika, the quilted padded jacket, was not glamorous. It was practical. It trapped warmth. Could be produced in large numbers. It could be worn by soldiers who needed to live outdoors in conditions that punished exposed bodies. The Valenki felt boots had their limitations. They were not magic and they could be poor in wet conditions, but in deep dry cold they offered insulation that thin leather boots could not. Thick mittens protected fingers better than gloves. Fur-lined caps protected ears. White smocks broke up the human shape against snow. None of this made a Soviet soldier invincible. It made him functional. And in December 1941, functional was enough to change the balance. A man who can still move is a different kind of soldier from a man who cannot. A man who can feel his fingers can load, aim, repair, dig, drag, signal, and crawl. A man whose feet are not frozen can retreat, attack, carry ammunition, help the wounded, or run when running is the only sensible act left. The German army had many fine pieces of equipment. It had experienced officers, disciplined formations, effective weapons, and soldiers who had endured months of brutal campaigning. But before Moscow, the comparison that mattered at times was painfully simple. One man could stay in the snow longer than another. One unit could move when another slowed. One sentry could remain alert while another fought sleep, numbness, and panic. Soviet winter gear was not merely clothing. It was part of a broader adaptation to place. Soldiers knew to layer, to cover ears and hands, to use snow, trees, folds in terrain, and white cloth to hide movement. Mechanics and drivers developed routines for engines in cold. Infantrymen learned how to lie still without becoming casualties of the weather before the enemy arrived. Ski troops and scouts used mobility where roads failed. Again, none of this should be romanticized. The Red Army suffered appallingly. Soviet logistics could be harsh and uneven. Many soldiers lacked ideal equipment. Many froze, starved, and died. But in the critical moment before Moscow, enough Soviet troops had enough winter preparation and enough winter familiarity to turn cold from a shared hardship into an unequal burden. That is the quiet brutality of adaptation. Both sides feel the weather. Only one side may be ready enough to act inside it. German soldiers noticed. They saw Soviet troops wrapped in padded clothing and white camouflage. They saw felt boots. They saw men who appeared out of the snow at distances too close for comfort. They saw enemy soldiers who were cold, yes, but not stopped. And they began to use what they could capture. A German soldier wearing a Soviet padded jacket was making a confession without words. Not political, not ideological, practical. He was admitting that the thing once dismissed as crude was better suited to keeping a man alive than the cleaner, sharper, more familiar clothing he had brought east. There is something almost cruel in that image. A soldier does not care about the pride of uniform design when his toes are going numb. He does not care whether a coat looks modern if the wind is cutting through his tunic. He does not care whether mittens make him look less like the army in recruitment posters. He wants warmth. He wants movement. He wants to survive the next hour. And before Moscow, the next hour mattered. The front was no longer a place where strategy unfolded cleanly. It was a place where bodies made decisions before commanders did. Fingers stiffened. Feet slowed. Skin cracked. Breath froze. Men huddled in dugouts and listened to the wind moving over the steppe and through the trees like something alive. What had looked backward from a distance became, up close, a form of knowledge. The Soviets had not invented winter. They had not mastered it. But they had respected it enough to dress for it, train around it, and fight inside it. The Germans had respected many things. Speed, concentration, firepower, command initiative, the operational art of destruction. They had respected the enemy less than they should have. And they had respected the Russian winter far too late. But gear alone does not attack. Men do. And as December opened, the soldiers in those quilted jackets and white smocks were not merely waiting in the snow. They were preparing to move through it. Ordinary men in the snow. The history of Moscow is often told with generals and arrows. Army Group Center, Stavka, Panzer Groups, Reserve Armies, counteroffensive sectors, names on maps, distances from the capital. Decisions made in headquarters where officers leaned over tables under weak lamps and tried to turn reports into certainty. But the winter battle was also decided by people whose names rarely survived. A Soviet driver waking before dawn to check whether his engine could be coaxed into life. A German machine gunner rubbing his hands together until the skin hurt, then placing them back on metal colder than pain. A Red Army sentry lying still beneath a white cover, knowing movement might reveal him but stillness might freeze him. A medic cutting away cloth from a foot that no longer looked alive. A horse handler standing beside an animal that had carried ammunition for weeks and could not rise. These were not heroic poses. They were tasks. War in deep cold is made of tasks repeated by exhausted people. Dry the socks if there is time. Keep the weapon clean. Protect the bolt. Keep snow out of the barrel. Do not sweat too much while marching, because sweat becomes cold later. Do not sleep too deeply. Do not remove gloves for longer than necessary. Watch the man beside you. If he stops speaking, check him. For German soldiers, much of this knowledge arrived as punishment. They adapted quickly where they could. Soldiers are practical people. They learn from pain. But learning in December outside Moscow meant learning after the margin had already narrowed. For Soviet soldiers, winter knowledge did not remove fear. It gave fear a routine. A man afraid of artillery still checks his mittens. A man afraid of tanks still wraps his feet. A man afraid he will not see morning still learns where to place his rifle so snow does not fill the mechanism. The ordinary habits of survival are not separate from combat. In winter, they are combat. One Soviet mechanic might spend hours beside a vehicle that did not want to wake. He would not call it doctrine. He would not call it strategic adaptation. He would call it work. Heat, cover, coax, listen. The sound of an engine catching in that cold was more than a mechanical success. It meant movement. It meant ammunition could move. A wounded man might be carried back. A gun might be repositioned. A unit might not be trapped. On the German side, mechanics fought the same battle with fewer advantages. They heated engines with improvised fires, drained fluids, cursed frozen parts, and worked with fingers that lost precision minute by minute. A trained mechanic who cannot feel a small tool is no longer the same mechanic. Cold takes skill and makes it clumsy. This is one reason winter is so dangerous in war. It does not only kill. It reduces. It reduces the marksman's touch, the driver's reaction, the surgeon's speed, the runner's stride, the officer's confidence. It turns trained men into slower versions of themselves. It turns small errors into permanent injuries. A German officer looking through binoculars might still see the battlefield as positions, tree lines, roads, and villages. But the soldier below him felt another geography. The distance from foxhole to ammunition box. The distance from a frozen boot to a field dressing station. The distance between one warm breath and the next. And then there was sleep. Cold sleep is not rest. It is negotiation. A man lies down because exhaustion forces him down. But some part of the mind stays afraid. Will he wake? Will his boots freeze harder? Will the enemy attack before dawn? Will the man beside him still be breathing? In Soviet lines, men suffered the same questions. But padded clothing, better cold weather habits, and a system more accustomed to winter gave many units the ability to endure the waiting. That mattered because before an attack, waiting is part of the attack. Troops must assemble. Guns must be moved. Orders must travel. Scouts must return. Men must hold themselves in readiness while the weather tries to empty them of strength. The German belief had been that superior operational skill would decide the campaign. And in many battles, skill had mattered terribly. But before Moscow, another kind of skill came forward. The skill of keeping men alive in snow. The skill of moving quietly through frozen woods. The skill of making crude equipment serve a precise purpose. The skill of knowing that a mitten may matter as much as a magazine if the hand inside it must still function at dawn. For the men on both sides, there was no grand lesson yet. Lessons are what later generations build from suffering. At the time, there was only the next duty. A Soviet soldier pulled a white smock over his padded jacket. A German sentry blinked ice from his eyelashes. A driver listened for the cough of an engine. A medic tucked a blanket around a casualty who had already lost too much heat. And in the dark before the Soviet counteroffensive, thousands of small acts of survival gathered into something larger. The German army was waiting for an enemy it believed had been nearly spent. But in the snow, men were forming up. And the weather that had weakened one army was about to conceal the movement of another. Attack in weather that should stop armies. To a freezing soldier, the idea of attack can feel obscene. Defense is hard enough. Standing watch is hard enough. Carrying ammunition through snow is hard enough. A man who has spent the night stamping his feet to keep blood moving does not easily imagine rising at dawn and crossing open ground under fire. And yet that was precisely the point. By early December 1941, German units before Moscow were exhausted. Their advance had brought them close enough to the Soviet capital for the city to feel almost within reach, but not close enough to end the war. They were at the edge of strength. Some formations had been fighting for months with little rest. Vehicles were worn. Horses were dying. Ammunition and fuel were uncertain. Winter clothing remained inadequate in many places. Frostbite was no longer an exception. It was part of the front's daily arithmetic. Many German officers still knew the Red Army could fight. They were not fools. They had seen Soviet resistance harden. But there remained an assumption, sometimes spoken, sometimes merely felt, that the Soviets had been hurt too badly to mount a major blow at the decisive moment. That assumption was about to fail. The Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow, beginning on December 5th, did not come from nowhere. Reserves had been gathered. Units had been moved. Intelligence, command decisions, and the brutal urgency of defending the capital all played their part. The story of Siberian divisions is often simplified, and it should be handled carefully. Troops from the east did matter, but they were part of a larger Soviet effort, not a single miracle arriving on skis from legend. What matters for this story is how the attack felt to the men receiving it. For German soldiers in forward positions, the Soviet movement through snow seemed almost impossible because they themselves were already being broken by the same conditions. That is one of the most frightening experiences in war. Seeing the enemy do what your own body tells you cannot be done. The Soviet soldiers were not warm in any comfortable sense. They were not untouched by cold. They were cold, hungry, frightened, and tired. But many were dressed and organized well enough to move. Their winter gear did not erase suffering. It preserved function. And function, in war, is often the line between a force and a crowd. Artillery began in the darkness. Soviet guns fired from positions hidden by snow and distance. Shells struck German lines, road junctions, villages, and assembly points. Communications faltered. Field telephones failed or were cut. Radios crackled. Reports came in broken pieces. Enemy infantry advancing. White camouflage. Pressure on the flank. Need ammunition. Cannot move guns. Engine failure. The words varied. The meaning did not. The front was changing. Soviet ski troops and scouts used terrain that seemed hostile to ordinary movement. Infantry advanced through forests and across fields where snow concealed both danger and opportunity. White smocks made men difficult to distinguish until they were closer than expected. The German eye, trained to search for movement, found itself betrayed by a world without color. A white figure in white snow is not invisible. But he does not have to be invisible. He only has to be seen a few seconds too late. Those seconds mattered. A machine gunner with numb hands takes longer to adjust. A rifleman with stiff fingers fires slower. A unit whose boots have failed cannot shift position quickly. A truck that will not start cannot bring ammunition forward. A gun team without horses cannot move the weapon before the enemy finds the range. The Soviet attack did not need winter to fight instead of soldiers. It needed winter to reduce German reaction time, German mobility, German endurance, German certainty. Before Moscow, cold became a combat multiplier. It multiplied the effect of Soviet pressure because the German army was already weakened by everything the campaign had demanded of it. The counteroffensive did not strike a fresh enemy. It struck an army at the end of a long road, in clothing not built for the moment, with machines that disliked the temperature and men whose bodies were beginning to fail. Some German soldiers fought with extraordinary stubbornness. Many units resisted fiercely. The retreat from Moscow was not a simple route everywhere, and any serious account must respect the discipline and suffering of those who held positions under impossible conditions. But courage cannot thaw oil. Discipline cannot replace boots. Orders cannot restore circulation to deadened toes. In one village after another, along roads and fields west of Moscow, the German belief that one final effort might force victory collided with the Soviet ability to fight in the season Germany had tried to outrun. The most unsettling part was not only that the Soviets attacked. It was that they kept attacking. The front line that had seemed frozen in place now moved under the pressure of men who were dressed, supplied, and prepared just enough to make the weather serve them better than it served their enemy. The German soldier from the opening, still fighting with his rifle and his hands, would not have seen the strategic picture. He would not have known the full extent of the counteroffensive. He would have known only what was in front of him. Snow, muzzle flashes, shouting, the scrape of metal, the failure of warmth, and the terrible realization that the enemy was not stopped by the cold. And that realization carried a question no report could soften. If winter could not stop the Red Army, What exactly had the German army been counting on? When the snow began to move, the first hours of the Soviet counteroffensive did not look the same everywhere. In some sectors, the attack came as artillery, then infantry. In others, probing movements became pressure, and pressure became rupture. Some German positions held longer than expected. Others bent quickly because they had almost nothing left to bend with. Commanders tried to understand whether they faced local attacks or something larger. The answer arrived unevenly, through reports delayed by weather, broken wires, damaged radios, and men too cold to speak clearly. At the front, there was no clean overview. There was only impact. A German unit holding a village might hear the guns first, then see shapes moving between houses at the edge of visibility. Men inside wooden buildings, wrapped in whatever warmth they had, rushed to firing positions. Snow fell from rafters when nearby shells struck. A machine gun was dragged toward a window. Someone cursed because the belt had stiffened. Someone else shouted for more ammunition. Outside, a horse screamed. Then the sound stopped. The Soviet infantry came forward in winter clothing that seemed made from the landscape itself. Not perfect, not ghostly, just difficult to see quickly. The white camouflage broke up outlines. Padded jackets gave bulk to bodies already carrying rifles, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools, and fear. A German soldier firing from a doorway might not think, "This is the result of superior winter preparation." He would think, "They are closer than I thought." And sometimes that was enough. The battlefield before Moscow was not a single cinematic charge. It was a sequence of local crises. A road cut here, a flank threatened there, a village abandoned because staying meant encirclement, a gun left behind because the team could not move it, a truck burned because it would not start and could not be allowed to fall intact, a wounded man placed on a sled, then removed because ammunition had to go first. War in winter slows some things and accelerates others. Movement through snow is slow. Retreat with wounded is slow. Repair is slow. Digging is slow. But collapse, when it begins, can feel very fast because the reserves needed to stop it are not where they should be, and the vehicles needed to bring them forward are frozen, broken, or out of fuel. German commanders faced a problem that maps could barely express. A line on paper might still exist, but the men holding it were losing the physical ability to make that line real. Units could be ordered to counterattack, but counterattack required movement. Movement required feet, fuel, horses, functioning weapons, and enough warmth to keep human beings inside the category of soldiers rather than casualties. The Soviets suffered heavily too. They advanced into fire. Men fell in snow and disappeared into it. Wounded soldiers froze if they were not carried back quickly. Artillery did not become gentle because the men firing it wore padded jackets. The Red Army paid in blood for ground west of Moscow. But the point was not that Soviet winter gear made war easy. The point was that it made action possible. In one sector, a Soviet platoon might crawl forward through snow toward a German machine gun position. The men's breath would betray them if they rose too soon. Their rifles would be cold under their gloves. Their faces would burn where skin met air. They would be afraid. Of course they were afraid. But fear with warm enough hands can still pull a pin from a grenade. Fear with feet that still feel the ground can still crawl the last meters. On the German side, fear had a different companion. Numbness, the kind that begins as discomfort, becomes pain, then becomes something worse than pain because it removes the body's warnings. A soldier may look at his hand and see it as a tool no longer fully under command. He may stamp his feet and feel nothing. He may know that if he survives the attack, the frostbite will remain. These are not dramatic battlefield injuries in the usual sense. No explosion, no visible wound at first. But frostbite removes men from combat. It turns survivors into evacuees. It fills aid stations. It changes the strength of a unit without the enemy needing to aim. And when the German line began to fall back from positions near Moscow, the retreat itself became another winter battle. Retreat is movement under pressure. In summer, it is dangerous. In winter, with poor clothing and failing transport, it becomes a test of whether an army can remain an army while moving backward through cold. Equipment must be chosen. What can be saved? What must be destroyed? Who can walk? Who needs a cart? Which wounded can be moved before the enemy arrives? These are not questions generals like to write in memoirs, but soldiers live inside them. A gun crew may have served a weapon for months, dragged it, cleaned it, trusted it, slept near it. Then one morning they are told to leave it because no team can pull it out. They remove what they can, damage what they must, and walk away. Behind them, the gun becomes a dark shape in snow. A driver may try one last time to start a truck. The starter turns weakly. The engine coughs. Nothing. He looks at the road, at the approaching sound of artillery, at the men watching him. Then someone brings fuel to burn it. That is how winter eats machines. Not always in battle. Sometimes in abandonment. By mid-December, the German advance on Moscow had been stopped and thrown back in places. The myth of uninterrupted German victory had been damaged. Not destroyed entirely, not in the minds of everyone, but cracked. The army that had seemed to move by its own law had found a limit. And one of the most humiliating parts of that limit was material and intimate. Clothing, boots, gloves, oil, blankets, the small things that do not appear heroic until men die without them. The Germans had mocked or dismissed what looked crude. Now some of them wore captured Soviet clothing because survival had become more important than pride. They had believed the Soviet soldier was backward. But before Moscow, the backward-looking soldier in winter gear was still advancing while German divisions struggled not to freeze in place. And yet even this does not fully explain the disaster. To understand why the cold mattered so much, we have to look at the arithmetic beneath the suffering, the small failures that multiplied until they became operational defeat. The mathematics of survival. A division does not stop fighting all at once. It fades by percentages. 5 men lost to frostbite in one company, then 12. Then a platoon's worth of men who can no longer march. A machine gun that fires slowly because the mechanism has stiffened. 2 trucks that fail to start. A horse team that collapses. An ammunition delivery delayed by 6 hours. A field kitchen that does not arrive. A patrol that returns late because snow covered the tracks. None of these alone sounds like defeat. Together, they change what a commander can do. That is the mathematics of survival. In ordinary battlefield language, armies count killed, wounded, missing, captured. They count tanks, guns, aircraft, shells, fuel. But winter adds another ledger. Men present but ineffective. Vehicles listed but immobile. Weapons held but unreliable. Positions occupied but not sustainable. Orders issued but physically impossible. What matters is not only the number, but what the number reveals. A rifle company may still exist on paper. Its commander may still report a strength figure. But how many men can stand for an hour? How many can dig? How many can shoot accurately? How many can move at night? How many have feet swollen, wrapped, numb, or infected? How many are awake only because fear is stronger than exhaustion? Cold changes the meaning of strength. The same is true for machines. A truck is not transportation if it cannot start. A gun is not mobile if no horse team can pull it. A tank is not a breakthrough weapon if fuel, oil, batteries, and maintenance cannot survive the climate. A radio is not command if cold, distance, and damage leave it silent. This is where Soviet winter gear mattered in a way that cannot be reduced to romance. A padded jacket did not win a battle by itself. Felt boots did not defeat a division. Mittens did not replace artillery. White camouflage did not make a soldier bulletproof. But each item preserved a fraction of human function. And war is often decided by preserved fractions. A hand kept warm enough to reload. A foot kept healthy enough to march. A body insulated enough to wait in ambush. A sentry alert enough to see movement. A scout concealed enough to close distance. A driver capable enough to keep supplies moving. The German army had built its campaign around the multiplication of advantages. Speed, surprise, concentration, command flexibility, tactical skill. Before Moscow, winter multiplied disadvantages with the same cold efficiency. Poor clothing multiplied exhaustion. Exhaustion multiplied slow reaction. Slow reaction multiplied tactical vulnerability. Tactical vulnerability multiplied retreat. Retreat multiplied abandonment. Abandonment multiplied shortage. Shortage multiplied suffering. And suffering multiplied fear. This is not poetry. It is how systems fail. Reports from the winter of 1941 to 42 describe severe frostbite and cold injuries in German ranks. Exact figures vary by source and period, and any number should be handled carefully. Verify German frostbite casualty totals for Army Group Center, winter 1941 to 42. But even without a single perfect number, the pattern is clear. Cold removed men from combat at scale. It damaged the fighting power of units already worn down by months of campaigning. Soviet forces also endured severe losses. Their winter equipment did not spare them from German fire, exhaustion, hunger, or exposure. But if one army can keep a larger portion of its men functioning in the same conditions, the balance shifts before the first shot is fired. That was the brutal calculation before Moscow. The Soviets did not need winter to kill every German soldier. They needed it to slow reactions, weaken positions, immobilize equipment, and make each German decision harder. And the Germans did not need to collapse everywhere for the offensive to fail. They only needed enough small failures to converge at the wrong time. Consider the trigger finger from the opening scene. One finger is nothing in a war of millions. But multiply it by hundreds of men across a line. Then add stiff rifle bolts, jammed machine guns, frozen optics, exhausted sentries, and delayed ammunition. Suddenly a detail becomes a condition. War turns details into outcomes. This is why mocked gear mattered. It was not because the Soviet jacket was elegant. It was because it answered a battlefield question Germany had postponed. How does a man remain useful in the cold? The answer had strategic consequences. A soldier kept warm enough to move can join an attack. A soldier too cold to move becomes part of the terrain. He may still be alive, still brave, still willing, but war measures function cruelly. It does not ask whether a man wants to fight. It asks whether he can. The German command had believed that morale, discipline, and operational pressure could carry the campaign to its conclusion. These things mattered. But before Moscow, they were forced into competition with physics. Cold thickens fluids. Cold drains batteries. Cold stiffens leather. Cold numbs nerves. Cold turns moisture into a weapon against the skin. Cold makes every minute outside a cost. The Soviet winter system, imperfect, uneven, sometimes crude, paid part of that cost in advance through preparation. The German system paid it at the front in human bodies. And when an army pays logistics debts with flesh, the bill always comes due. The numbers behind Moscow are not only casualty statistics. They are hours lost, vehicles abandoned, weapons silent, marches slowed, attacks delayed, retreats made chaotic. Men evacuated not because they were shot, but because winter had taken their feet. That was the arithmetic German divisions learned in the snow. But arithmetic does not cry out. Men do. And behind every calculation was someone trying to survive a night that seemed longer than the war itself. Frostbite, fear, and the long retreat. A man with frostbite does not always scream. Sometimes he is quiet because the worst part has already passed into numbness. In the aid stations behind the German lines, medics saw the cold written on bodies in ways that did not look like ordinary wounds. Feet swollen inside boots, toes pale, waxy, then dark, fingers stiff and useless, faces burned by wind. Men who had walked in because they could still move, then sat down and realized they might not stand again. A bullet wound announces itself. Cold can arrive like a whisper. For German medical personnel, the winter before Moscow created choices no training could make easy. Who could be treated and returned? Who had to be evacuated? Who could not be moved because transport was needed for ammunition, fuel, or other wounded? In war, compassion is often trapped inside logistics. A doctor may know what a man needs and still not have it. Soviet medics faced their own brutal realities. Their wounded lay in snow under fire. Evacuation was dangerous and slow. A man hit during an advance might freeze before stretcher bearers reached him. The cold punished both sides. It had no politics. It did not distinguish between languages. But the German retreat from Moscow gave winter a particular cruelty. Men who had advanced for months now moved backward through the world they had helped destroy. Villages burned or damaged. Roads blocked. Horses dead in harness. Vehicles abandoned. Equipment too heavy to carry left behind. Soldiers wrapped in rags, blankets, captured clothing, anything. Some wore Soviet padded jackets over German uniforms. Some cut cloth from civilian bedding. Some stuffed paper inside boots. It was not orderly. It was not dignified. It was survival. There is a kind of photograph from that winter that says more than many official reports. A German soldier standing in snow, his uniform almost hidden beneath layers of improvised covering, face drawn, eyes lowered, no longer resembling the sharp image of the army that had entered the Soviet Union in summer. He does not look defeated in the theatrical sense. He looks used up. That is worse. The war did not pause to let men recover from cold injuries. Units had to hold, move, retreat, counterattack, dig in again. The Soviet pressure continued. Artillery fell. Patrols probed. Roads filled with men trying to bring order to motion. Officers attempted to keep formations intact. Non-commissioned officers counted men, cursed stragglers, helped the wounded, and tried not to show fear. Fear in retreat is different from fear in attack. In attack, fear moves forward with the body. In retreat, fear follows from behind. It asks whether the enemy is closer than reported, whether the road ahead is blocked, whether the man who falls can be lifted, whether the next village has shelter, whether sleeping will mean dying. For many German soldiers, Moscow became not a single battle but a memory of cold layered over everything else. Cold in the weapon, cold in the boot, cold in the stomach, cold in the thought that command had not understood what the men now understood physically. That realization is dangerous to morale. Soldiers can endure suffering when they believe it is necessary. They can endure terrible losses when they believe the plan, however harsh, has meaning. But when suffering appears to come from miscalculation, from an assumption made far above them, it leaves another kind of wound. They had believed the campaign would be over. It was not. They had believed winter gear could wait. Could not. They had believed Soviet equipment was crude. Now they were taking it from the dead. There is no need to exaggerate the suffering. The truth is heavy enough. Men froze. Men lost limbs. Men died in snow. Men survived and carried winter inside them long after the front moved elsewhere. On the Soviet side, victory before Moscow also carried a cost. The counteroffensive demanded lives from soldiers who were not symbols but people. Young men from villages, workers, students, reservists, officers under pressure, medics who moved toward the wounded because someone had to. Their gear helped them endure, but endurance is not comfort. A padded jacket does not make artillery less lethal. Felt boots do not soften grief. The difference was not that one side suffered and the other did not. The difference was that one side had prepared enough of its men to keep turning suffering into movement. And movement mattered. Soviet troops pushed German forces back from the immediate approaches to Moscow. The capital did not fall. The German army suffered its first major strategic setback on land. The world saw that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. But on the ground, the meaning came in smaller forms. A Soviet soldier entering a recaptured village and finding abandoned German equipment stiff under snow. A German medic watching another man carried in with feet beyond saving. A staff officer reading casualty and supply reports and understanding, too late, that winter clothing had not been a comfort item. It had been combat equipment. By the time this truth became undeniable, many of the men who needed it most were already gone from the line. Evacuated, captured, dead, or walking west in boots that had failed them. The official recognition would come in reports, orders, emergency collections, adjustments, and later analysis. But the first recognition had already happened in silence. A soldier pulling on captured Soviet gear. A commander seeing his unit's strength reduced by frostbite. A mechanic standing beside an engine that would not start. A rifleman staring at his hand and realizing it could no longer obey him. Before Moscow, the German army learned that winter was not a backdrop to battle. It was inside the battle. And now the reports began to say what the snow had already proven. Reports from a frozen army. Military institutions prefer clean language. They write of supply deficiencies, reduced combat effectiveness, weather-related casualties, mobility limitations, equipment losses, operational delays. These phrases are useful. They are necessary. They allow commanders to understand patterns across chaos. But they also soften reality. Supply deficiency can mean a man without boots fit for the temperature. Reduced combat effectiveness can mean a platoon where too many men cannot hold rifles properly. Mobility limitation can mean a gun abandoned because the horses are dead and the truck will not start. Weather-related casualties can mean toes removed, fingers lost, men who froze in sleep, men who lived but never returned to the same body. By late 1941 and into the winter of 1941-42, German reports could no longer avoid the scale of the problem. The army had not merely encountered cold. It had been damaged by its own lack of preparation for cold. Winter clothing shortages became a matter of urgency. Emergency measures were taken. Civilian clothing drives in Germany sought coats, furs, scarves, gloves, and anything that might help soldiers in the East. Improvisation became policy because policy had arrived late. There is something deeply revealing in such measures. An army that had planned conquest now depended on collected garments from home to keep men alive at the front. The distance between the grand design and the actual need had become almost unbearable. On one end, maps, speeches, strategic objectives. On the other, a soldier needing dry socks. The German command did not universally ignore winter out of stupidity. The reality was more complicated. Some officers warned of problems. Some supply personnel worked under impossible constraints. Some winter equipment was available but could not be distributed effectively. The system was not a cartoon of incompetence. It was a military machine trapped by its own assumptions, distances, priorities, and the enemy's refusal to collapse. That makes the lesson sharper. Disaster does not always come because no one sees the danger. Sometimes it comes because the danger is seen, but not given enough weight soon enough. The Soviet winter gear that German soldiers had once dismissed now appeared in German hands. Captured padded jackets, felt boots, fur caps, mittens, these were used because they worked. On the battlefield, usefulness outranks pride. A soldier freezing in a foxhole does not ask whether the garment belongs to the enemy's image of modernity. He asks whether it keeps him alive. The Red Army understood this kind of practicality. Its equipment was often rugged, simple, and built for conditions that punished delicacy. Soviet design and supply were not flawless. Far from it. But in winter before Moscow, the value of simple, cold-weather functionality became obvious. German recognition came late because the original belief had been so powerful. Win quickly. Avoid winter. Break the Soviet state before climate becomes decisive. Every later admission had to pass through the ruins of that belief. And yet the lesson was not limited to clothing. Once commanders understood the problem, they had to confront the broader truth. The German army had entered a war of space, weather, attrition, and endurance while still hoping to win it as a war of decisive operational collapse. Moscow showed that the Soviet Union could absorb blows and keep fighting. It showed that distance could wear down tactical excellence. It showed that logistics could become strategy. It showed that climate could punish arrogance without ever needing to choose sides. Reports from the front carried these truths upward, but reports are always late. They arrive after the shelling, after the frostbite, after the retreat, after the abandoned guns are already under snow. For the men who lived through it, no report was needed. They had seen the difference between a soldier dressed for winter and a soldier dressed for a campaign that was supposed to end before winter. They had felt the difference between a weapon maintained for cold and one fighting its own oil. They had watched Soviet troops appear from white ground and understood, in the most practical way, that the enemy had not been stopped by the season. This recognition did not immediately transform the war. Armies learned slowly, especially while fighting. The Eastern Front would see more winters, more suffering, more adaptation, more failure, more brutality on a scale beyond easy description. But Moscow remained a lesson written early and hard. It was the moment when Germany's belief in quick victory froze at the edge of the Soviet capital. Not metaphorically, physically, in boots, engines, rifles, wounds, and graves. And from that winter forward, no serious soldier on the Eastern Front could pretend that weather was merely background. It had become part of planning, part of supply, part of morale, part of combat power. The German army had learned, too late for many men, that survival equipment was not secondary. It was the foundation on which fighting rested. But the legacy of Moscow was larger than winter clothing. It reached into the myth of invincibility itself. Because an army that cannot keep its men functioning in the real world cannot live forever inside the world it imagined. Winter was never just weather again. Moscow did not end the Second World War. It did not destroy the German army. It did not remove the terrible power Germany would still bring to the Eastern Front. It did not spare the Soviet Union from future disasters, sieges, offensives, and losses beyond ordinary human scale. But Moscow changed the meaning of the war. For the first time on land, the image of inevitable German victory was openly broken. The Wehrmacht had been stopped before a capital it had expected to threaten into collapse. The Red Army had not vanished under the blows of 1941. The Soviet state had not disintegrated. The winter counteroffensive forced the world to reconsider what had seemed, only months earlier, almost unstoppable. And inside that larger turning point was a quieter lesson. War is not fought by plans alone. It is fought by bodies inside weather. That sounds simple until an army forgets it. A commander may speak of operational objectives, but the soldier must still keep his feet. A general may order movement, but engines must still start. A headquarters may calculate strength, but a man with frostbitten hands changes the meaning of that strength. A campaign may be designed around speed, but speed ends when the road, the fuel, the horse, the boot, and the body fail together. Before Moscow, Soviet winter gear became a symbol of a broader truth. Adaptation can look unimpressive until conditions reveal its purpose. A quilted jacket is not dramatic. A felt boot is not a tank. A mitten does not appear in victory parades as an instrument of strategy. But these things preserved the human capacity to act. And the capacity to act is what armies are made of. The Germans had mocked or underestimated what they saw as crude. But the battlefield does not reward elegance for its own sake. It rewards what works under pressure. And in the frozen approaches to Moscow, what worked was often simple, heavy, worn, patched, and deeply practical. The legacy was not that Soviet equipment was perfect. It was not. The legacy was that the Soviet system, in enough places and at the right moment, had respected the conditions of its own battlefield more than the invader had. It had dressed men for a war that would continue in snow. It had built habits around cold. It had treated winter not as an interruption but as an environment in which war could still be fought. That mattered long after December 1941. Future operations on the Eastern Front would continue to be shaped by weather, logistics, adaptation, and endurance. Both sides learned. Both sides adjusted. Both sides suffered. But the lesson of Moscow remained beneath everything. Climate is not neutral when one army is ready for it and the other is not. For Warfront Archive, this is where the channel's central question returns. What did they believe? They believed speed could defeat space. They believed the Soviet Union would break before winter. They believed crude-looking gear revealed backwardness. They believed the decisive factors would be tanks, aircraft, encirclements, and command will. And what really happened? The Soviet Union did not break. The roads stretched. The weather turned. The front froze. The equipment that looked crude kept men alive. The winter that German planners had hoped to avoid became part of the Soviet defense and counterattack. The ordinary soldier in a padded jacket became not a symbol of backwardness, but a reminder that survival is a military skill. This is why the story still matters. Not because clothing alone changed the fate of the war. That would be too simple. It matters because clothing reveals the hidden architecture of war. It reveals what an army thinks the future will be. It reveals what commanders value. It reveals whether planners have imagined the real conditions under which their soldiers must obey orders. A uniform is never just cloth. It is an argument about the battlefield. In 1941, the German army carried east an argument built around fast victory. The Soviet winter gear carried another argument. The war may last into the cold, and the man who survives the cold may still be there when the enemy expects him gone. Before Moscow, those arguments met. One froze, the other advanced. And now, to close the story, we return to the man in the snow, the rifle in his hands, and the small sound of metal resisting human will. What they believed, what really happened. The rifle bolt moved at last. Not smoothly, not confidently. It scraped backward under a hand that could barely feel its own strength. The German infantryman west of Moscow did not need a historian to explain what was happening. He did not need a staff report. He did not need a speech about logistics or climate or operational overreach. He had the truth in his fingers. The war had reached the body. Around him, the morning widened into gray light. Snow lifted under shell bursts. Voices came and vanished. Somewhere ahead, Soviet soldiers in white camouflage moved between trees and broken fences, their padded clothing turning them into shapes that belonged to the season. They were not untouched by suffering. They were not mythical winter warriors immune to fear or cold. They were men doing what war demanded of them. But they could still move. That was the difference. In the summer, German commanders had believed the campaign would be decided before winter could speak. They had believed that speed, violence, and operational skill would solve the Soviet problem before the weather became a strategic force. They had believed that the enemy's heavy winter clothing, felt boots, mittens, and plain padded jackets belonged to a backward army. The battlefield answered slowly at first, with mud, then distance, then frost, then engines that failed before dawn, then rifles that resisted, then men evacuated with feet destroyed by cold. Then Soviet troops attacking through the very weather that was reducing German divisions from the inside. There was no single moment when every illusion died. War rarely grants such clarity. Beliefs break unevenly. One officer understands before another. One soldier knows before the report is written. One unit adapts while another pays. But before Moscow, the central illusion could no longer remain whole. Winter had not been avoided. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. The gear that looked crude had preserved fighting power. And the German army, which had mocked survival as backwardness, found itself searching for warmth in captured coats, blankets, straw, curtains, and anything else the real world would allow. This story should not be told as a simple morality play. The German soldier freezing outside Moscow was not personally responsible for every assumption made above him. The Soviet soldier advancing through snow was not a symbol carved from ice. Both were human beings inside systems larger than themselves, carrying fear, exhaustion, hunger, and the private hope of living one more day. That is what makes the lesson heavier. War punishes illusions through ordinary people. A commander believes a campaign will end before winter, and a rifleman loses his toes. A planner assigns transport priorities, and a medic cuts frozen cloth from a man's foot. A staff map shows movement still possible, and a driver stands beside an engine that will not start. A uniform is dismissed as crude, and later the enemy wears it to survive. Before Moscow, reality did not arrive as one grand revelation. It arrived as cold metal, as stiff leather, as breath freezing on a scarf, as white figures moving through snow. They had believed Soviet winter gear was primitive, heavy, and unworthy of fear. But what really happened was colder and more honest. That gear kept men alive long enough to fight, long enough to move, long enough to counterattack at the moment when German divisions were discovering that courage without preparation can still freeze in place. Not perfect, not invincible, not the only reason Moscow held, but real. And in war, reality is the only argument that survives. If you are watching from a place touched by this history, share where you are in the comments. And if someone in your family served, suffered, or lived through the war years, you are welcome to leave their story there as well. Warfront Archive is built for these forgotten details, the moments where belief met reality, and ordinary people carried the cost. Subscribe if you want to keep following the stories that history often leaves half buried in the snow.